The sun hung low over the plains of New Dakota, casting long shadows across the red dust that covered everything on this frontier world. Jake Morrison rode his horse slowly toward the watering hole, the same route he had taken every week for the past 3 years. The horse knew the way by heart now, and Jake let his mind wander as they moved through the heat. New Dakota was not an easy place to live, but it was home. Humans had terraformed this planet 2 decades ago, and now it served as one of the outer colonies where people came to start over or escape the crowded inner worlds. Jake had come here after his parents died, bringing his younger sister Kate with him. They had built a small ranch together. Nothing fancy, just enough to survive and maybe put away a few credits for the future. As they approached the watering hole, Jake noticed something odd. Fresh tracks marked the ground and the earth near the water looked disturbed. Someone had been digging recently. Jake pulled his horse to a stop and squinted through the shimmering heat. A figure crouched near the water's edge, hunched over a shallow hole in the ground. The figure was not human. Jake could tell that much from the way it moved, with too many limbs working in coordination. It was a Zenthari, one of the insectoid aliens who shared this sector of space with humans. The Zenthari were traders mostly, logical creatures who kept to themselves and followed their own customs. Jake had dealt with a few at the colony's market, and they seemed harmless enough. But something about this scene felt wrong. Jake urged his horse forward slowly, his hand moving to the plasma pistol at his hip. As he drew closer, he could see what the Zenthari was doing. The alien was placing something small into the hole, something wrapped in cloth that moved weakly. Jake's stomach turned when he realized what he was seeing. 2 tiny forms, no bigger than human infants, were being lowered into the earth. They were alive! He could see them struggling against the fabric that bound them. Jake did not think. He just acted. He dismounted quickly and drew his pistol, the weapon humming to life in his hand. The Zenthari looked up, its compound eyes reflecting the sunlight in 1,000 directions. For a moment, neither moved. Then Jake spoke, his voice hard and steady. Step away from them. The Zenthari clicked its mandibles together, a sound Jake had learned meant confusion or surprise. It straightened up, its forearms spreading in what might have been a gesture of peace or explanation. This not concern you, human. This is Zenthari matter. Cultural practice. You understand? Jake kept the pistol trained on the alien. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hand stayed steady. I understand you're burying babies alive. Step away. Now. The Zenthari's body language shifted, becoming more agitated. Its limbs twitched in rapid patterns. These are my offspring. They are defective. Cannot join the hive properly. Cannot contribute. Mercy to remove them now. Before they suffer in life they cannot complete. This is our way, old way. Correct way. Jake moved closer, positioning himself between the Zenthari and the shallow grave. I don't care about your way. Those are living babies, and you're not burying them while I'm standing here. The standoff stretched for several long seconds. Jake could see the alien calculating, trying to understand why the human cared about Zenthari offspring. Finally, the creature took a step back, its limbs lowering in submission or perhaps resignation. You make mistake, human. You interfere in what you not understand. This bring trouble for you. For all humans here. Jake did not respond. He holstered his pistol and dropped to his knees beside the hole, pulling the wrapped bundles out as carefully as he could. The fabric was some kind of Zenthari material, rough and warm. Inside, 2 tiny Zenthari infants moved weakly, their small bodies barely bigger than his hands. They looked fragile, their exoskeletons not yet hardened, their eyes still clouded. But they were alive, and they were trying to breathe. Jake pulled off his shirt and wrapped the infants in it, holding them close to his chest. They felt cool to the touch, and he wondered if that was normal for Zenthari, or if they were dying from exposure. What genetic defect? Jake asked, not looking up at the alien. What's wrong with them? The Zenthari made a chittering sound that might have been a laugh or a dismissal. They have mutation. Brain structure different. Will not connect to hive mind properly. Will think as individuals too much. Cannot serve collective. Cannot fulfill purpose. Better to return to Earth now than let them live broken. Jake looked down at the 2 small beings in his arms. They did not look broken to him. They looked like babies, helpless and in need of protection. You're wrong, Jake said quietly. And I'm taking them. He stood up carefully, cradling the infants against his chest. His horse waited patiently nearby. Jake managed to mount while holding the babies, though it was awkward. The Zenthari watched him with its compound eyes, unreadable and alien. You take my offspring, you take my problem. Human law cannot protect you. Zenthari law will find you. This not over. Jake turned his horse toward home. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. He rode away from the watering hole, leaving the Zenthari standing alone beside the empty grave. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and Jake kept the two small bodies pressed close to his chest, feeling their tiny movements as they struggled to live. He did not know what he was going to do. He did not know if Kate could help them. He did not know what kind of trouble he had just bought for himself and his sister. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He could not have walked away. Some things were more important than politics or culture or keeping the peace. Some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight was one you could not win. As his horse carried him across the dusty plains toward home, Jake Morrison had no idea that his simple act of compassion would change the entire galaxy. All he knew was that he had two lives in his hands and he was going to do everything in his power to keep them alive. Kate Morrison was checking the water filtration system when she heard her brother's horse approaching the ranch at a speed that meant trouble. She dropped her tools and ran toward the front of their small homestead, wiping sweat from her forehead. Jake never rushed the horse unless something was seriously wrong. When she saw him riding in with his shirt off and something bundled against his chest, her medical training kicked in before her questions could form. Inside, now, she said, holding open the door as Jake dismounted awkwardly. What happened? Are you hurt? Jake shook his head and carefully opened the bundle. Kate's eyes went wide when she saw the two tiny Zenthari infants struggling weakly in the fabric. Jake, what did you do? He told her everything while she worked, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined the babies. Kate had been a colonial medic for 5 years before she retired to the ranch, and she had treated dozens of different species during that time. Zenthari physiology was not completely foreign to her, though she had never handled infants this young. They're hypothermic and dehydrated, she said, her voice shifting into the calm professional tone Jake remembered from when they were younger. I need to set up warming units and figure out what they can digest. Go get my emergency medical kit from the storage room, the big gray one. Jake hurried to get the kit while Kate cleared their kitchen table and began setting up a makeshift medical station. Within an hour, she had both infants stabilized, wrapped in thermal blankets with hydration lines running into their small bodies. They were still weak, but their movements became stronger as their body temperature normalized. They're going to make it, Kate said, sitting down heavily in a chair. But Jake, do you understand what you've done? There are laws about interfering with alien cultural practices. The non-interference directive is very clear. Jake stared at the two tiny beings on the table, watching their small chests rise and fall with each breath. He was burying them alive, Kate. They were moving, trying to breathe. I couldn't just ride away. Kate ran her hands through her hair, a gesture she always made when she was stressed. I know. I wouldn't have been able to either. But that doesn't change the fact that we're about to have a very serious problem. She was right. By the next morning, everyone in the small human settlement knew what had happened. The story spread through the community like wildfire. Some people came to the ranch to offer support, bringing supplies and words of encouragement. Others stayed away, nervous about the political implications. Governor Phillips, the colonial administrator, contacted Jake through the communication system and asked him to come to the settlement's government building. Jake left Kate with the infants and rode into town. The governor's office was a simple prefabricated structure that served as the administrative center for the colony. Phillips was a tired-looking man in his 50s who had been managing New Dakota for the past decade. He looked even more tired than usual when Jake entered. Sit down, Jake. We need to talk about what you've done. Jake sat, his jaw set. He had expected this conversation. I know about the non-interference directive, Governor, but those were babies. Living babies. Phillips nodded slowly. I understand your position. Truly I do. But the directive exists for a reason. We're newcomers to this part of space. We share it with species that have been here for thousands of years. If we start imposing our values on their cultural practices, it creates conflict, and conflict can lead to war. Jake leaned forward. So we're supposed to just ignore murder? We're supposed to look the other way when children are killed because it's someone else's tradition? The governor closed his eyes for a moment. It's not that simple. The Zenthari don't see it as murder. In their culture, the collective is more important than the individual. They remove offspring that can't contribute to the hive. It's been their practice for millennia. That doesn't make it right. Phillips looked at Jake with something like sympathy. Right and wrong are complicated concepts when you're dealing with alien minds. Jake, what seems obviously wrong to us might be necessary for them. We can't judge. Jake stood up, his hands balling into fists. Yes, we can. If we stand for anything as humans, we should stand for protecting those who can't protect themselves. Otherwise, what's the point? Why did we even come out here to the stars if we're just going to abandon our principles the moment they become inconvenient? Before Phillips could respond, alarms sounded outside. Both men rushed to the window. A group of Zenthari had arrived at the settlement's edge, at least a dozen of them. At the front stood the same alien Jake had confronted at the watering hole. They were not armed, but their presence was clearly a demonstration of force. Phillips grabbed his communication device. Get the militia to the main road. Peaceful positions only, but be ready. And somebody find Jake Morrison's location. He looked at Jake. They're here for you, or more accurately, they're here for those infants. Jake and the governor walked out to meet the Zenthari delegation. A small group of human militia members had already formed a loose perimeter, their weapons lowered but ready. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The Zenthari who had been at the watering hole stepped forward. Up close and in better light, Jake could see the intricate patterns on its exoskeleton, marks that probably indicated rank or family. I am Kral Thor of the Western Hive. You have taken my offspring. Zenthari law demands their return so that proper tradition can be completed. This is not negotiable. Governor Phillips spoke before Jake could respond. Kral Thor, we understand this is a difficult situation, but the infants are currently under medical care. Perhaps we can arrange a meeting to discuss this matter through proper diplomatic channels. Kral Thor's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation. No discussion needed. Human took what belongs to Zenthari. Must return. Our tradition is sacred. Our ways are ancient. You have no right to judge what you do not understand. Jake stepped forward, ignoring the governor's warning hand on his shoulder. I understand perfectly. You were going to kill 2 healthy babies because they're different. Because they don't fit into your system. That's not tradition. That's murder. The other Zenthari began clicking and chittering among themselves, their limbs moving in agitated patterns. Kral Thor's body language became more aggressive. You speak of things beyond your knowledge, human. These offspring cannot join hive mind, cannot serve collective purpose, will suffer entire life being disconnected. Mercy to release them now. This is compassion in our culture. Kate's voice came from behind them. She had arrived on one of the ranch vehicles and she walked forward to stand beside her brother. I've examined those infants thoroughly, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. There's nothing physically wrong with them. Whatever genetic variation they have doesn't impair their ability to live healthy lives. You're not saving them from suffering. You're killing them because they're inconvenient to your social structure. Kral Thor turned his compound eyes on Kate. Human female medic does not understand Zenthari biology or culture, cannot make judgment on Zenthari matters. Kate did not back down. I understand biology just fine, and I understand that every intelligent species in the galaxy shares one common trait. We protect our children. It's the most basic instinct there is. What you're doing goes against your own nature. The standoff continued as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Neither side was willing to give ground. Finally, Kral Thor spoke again. This matter will go to Galactic Council. Human colony has violated non-interference directive. There will be consequences. We will return with proper authority. He looked directly at Jake. And we will reclaim what is ours. The Zenthari delegation turned and left, their movements synchronized in a way that reminded everyone watching just how alien they truly were. When they were gone, Governor Phillips turned to Jake and Kate. You've started something that's going to be much bigger than this colony. I hope you're ready for what comes next. Jake looked back toward the ranch where 2 tiny lives depended on him and his sister. Ready or not, I'm not backing down. Those babies deserve a chance to live. The news traveled faster than anyone expected. Within 3 days, the incident on New Dakota had reached the inner worlds and eventually made its way to the Galactic Council headquarters. The council was a massive station that orbited a neutral star system, serving as the meeting place for 12 different spacefaring species. Humans were the newest members, having joined only 50 years ago, when they finally developed reliable faster-than-light travel. In galactic terms, humanity was still a child, learning to navigate the complex politics of a crowded universe. Ambassador Claire Hughes received the emergency summons while she was reviewing trade agreements with the Draconian delegation. She was a career diplomat who had spent the last 20 years of her life working to secure humanity's place among the older species. When she read the report about Jake Morrison and the Xanthari infants, she felt her carefully constructed diplomatic foundation begin to crack. "This is a disaster," she muttered to her assistant, a young man named Peter who had only been with the diplomatic corps for 2 years. "Do you understand what this means? We've violated one of the fundamental principles that holds this council together." Peter looked uncomfortable. "But Ambassador, he saved 2 babies. Surely the council will understand that." Claire shook her head. "The council doesn't work on human morality, Peter. It works on precedent and law. If we allow one species to interfere with another's cultural practices, where does it end? Every species here has traditions that others might find objectionable. The non-interference directive is what keeps us from constant conflict." She was right to be worried. The Xanthari delegation called for an emergency session within hours. The council chamber was a circular room with viewing platforms for each member species, arranged so that no one had a position of superiority. The design was meant to promote equality, though in practice, the older and more powerful species still held more sway. The Xanthari representative, an elder named Thaxor, opened the proceedings with a formal complaint. His voice was translated into multiple languages simultaneously by the council's advanced systems. The human known as Jake Morrison has committed a grave violation of the non-interference directive. He forcibly prevented a Xanthari citizen from completing a traditional and legal cultural practice. He then took possession of Xanthari offspring without permission or authority. This action threatens the foundation of peaceful coexistence between our species. We demand that the human be arrested, tried, and punished. We further demand the immediate return of the offspring so that proper tradition may be completed." Claire stood to respond, choosing her words carefully. The Galactic Council recognizes the importance of cultural autonomy. However, we must also recognize that there are fundamental principles that transcend individual cultures. The protection of children, of helpless beings who cannot defend themselves, is one such principle. Jake Morrison acted on basic compassion, a trait that we believe should be valued rather than punished. Thaxor's mandibles clicked sharply. Human Ambassador speaks of principles but ignores law. If each species decides which laws to follow based on their own feelings, there is no order. Only chaos. The debate continued for hours. Other species representatives joined in, each bringing their own perspectives. The Catherians, a telepathic species that shared thoughts across vast distances, argued that individual lives were less important than collective harmony. The Draconians, fierce warriors who valued strength above all else, questioned why anyone would fight to save the weak. The Lumens, beings of pure energy who experience time differently than corporeal species, suggested that the entire debate was meaningless because all outcomes had already occurred in their perception. But something unexpected happened during the discussions. A few representatives began to question their own assumptions. A young Draconian named Kira requested permission to speak, which was unusual since junior members rarely addressed the full council. "I wish to share a personal story," Kira said, her translated voice carrying a strange mixture of strength and vulnerability. In Draconian culture, female warriors are rare. Centuries ago, female hatchlings were often killed because males were considered superior fighters. "I survived only because my mother hid me and raised me in secret. When I was old enough, I proved myself in combat and earned my place. Now I am one of our finest soldiers." She paused, letting her words sink in. "If my mother had followed tradition, I would be dead. My culture would have lost a valuable warrior. I say this because sometimes our traditions are wrong. Sometimes they blind us to potential, to value, to the very things we claim to cherish. The human Jake Morrison may have broken a law, but perhaps he showed us a truth we needed to see." The council chamber erupted in discussion. The idea that cultural traditions could be questioned from within was not new, but hearing it stated so bluntly by a member of a proud warrior species was shocking. Meanwhile, back on New Dakota, Jake and Kate were dealing with their own challenges. The infants, whom Kate had started calling Hope and Dawn for lack of proper Xanthari names, were growing stronger each day. They responded to Kate's voice and touch, their small bodies developing at a rate that surprised her. She documented everything carefully, knowing that any information might be important later. Scientists from Earth had contacted her, asking for permission to study the infants remotely. Geneticists wanted to understand the mutation that marked them as defective in Xanthari society. Kate agreed, sending bioscans and genetic sequences through secure channels. What the scientists discovered was remarkable. The mutation did not weaken the infants. Instead, it enhanced certain neural pathways that allowed for more complex individual thought. In a species designed for hive-mind cooperation, these two infants had the potential to think completely independently. Dr. Lisa Chen, a geneticist specializing in alien biology, sent Kate a detailed analysis. What the Xanthari call a defect is actually an evolutionary leap, the message explained. These infants have cognitive abilities that surpass normal Xanthari by a significant margin. They'll never connect to the hive mind the way others do, but they'll be able to process information, create and innovate in ways their species hasn't seen in millennia. The Xanthari have been breeding this trait out of their population for thousands of years, prioritizing collective efficiency over individual brilliance. These babies represent what the Xanthari could become, if they embraced variation instead of eliminating it. Kate shared this information with Governor Phillips, who forwarded it to Ambassador Hughes. The data became a key part of the human defense at the council. If the infants were not actually defective, then killing them was not mercy. It was the suppression of evolution, the elimination of potential that threatened the status quo. The debate at the Galactic Council shifted. What had started as a simple case of law violation became a philosophical discussion about the nature of progress and tradition. Some species sided with the Xanthari, arguing that each culture had the right to define itself and its values. Others began to question whether the council should establish some kind of universal standards, basic rights that applied to all sentient beings regardless of species. The Lumens, who rarely involve themselves in temporal debates, made a surprising statement. We have observed many timelines and possibilities. In most futures where the Xanthari infants die, the Xanthari species stagnates and eventually declines. In futures where they live, new possibilities open. Change is coming to the Xanthari whether they accept it or not. The only question is whether they will embrace it or be consumed by it. This cryptic message did not solve the debate, but it added weight to the human position. Even species who valued tradition began to wonder if the Xanthari were harming themselves by rigidly adhering to ancient practices. Ambassador Hughes received thousands of messages from human colonies across dozens of worlds. The overwhelming sentiment was support for Jake Morrison. Humans from all walks of life, from all political backgrounds, united behind a simple idea. You do not kill babies. You do not stand by while children die. Whatever the cost, whatever the political consequences, humanity would not compromise on this principle. Claire Hughes realized that she was facing a defining moment for human presence in galactic politics. She could take the safe route, apologize for the violation and try to minimize damage to human standing. Or she could take a stand, risk everything humanity had built, and fight for what her species believed was right. She thought about Jake Morrison, a simple ranch hand on a frontier world who had acted without hesitation when faced with something wrong. He had not calculated political consequences or worried about diplomatic relations. He had just done what he thought was right. Claire made her decision. She would fight, not just for Jake Morrison, but for the principle that some things mattered more than politics. She began preparing a defense that would challenge the very foundations of how the Galactic Council operated. She knew it might fail. She knew humanity might face isolation or worse, but she also knew that some fights were worth having, regardless of the outcome. The Galactic Council had dealt with thousands of disputes over the centuries, but nothing quite like this. The case of Jake Morrison and the Xanthari infants had become more than a legal matter. It had become a mirror held up to every species, forcing them to examine their own values and traditions. As the debate stretched into its second week, unexpected voices began to speak up from across the galaxy. A Catherian philosopher named Zethara contacted the council with an unusual request. The Catherians were telepathic beings who shared thoughts across their entire species, experiencing reality as a collective consciousness. They were among the oldest council members and rarely involved themselves in what they considered primitive emotional debates. But Zethara had been studying humans for decades, fascinated by their chaotic and unpredictable nature. I wish to Present findings on human psychology and behavior, Zethara announced through the translation systems. Humans are unique among council species in ways that are relevant to this case. The council granted permission, curious about what the usually silent Catherians had to say. Zethara's presence materialized as a shimmering field of energy on the speaking platform. We Catherians experience all thoughts simultaneously. There is no individual, only the whole. We have studied the 12 council species extensively, seeking to understand how separated minds function. Most species prioritize their own kind, first, then their allies, then finally others if convenient. This is logical and expected. The energy field pulsed with different colors as Zethara continued. Humans are different. They possess what they call empathy, in a form more powerful than any species we have encountered. They can perceive suffering in beings completely unlike themselves and feel compelled to act. This Jake Morrison saw Zenthari infants, beings with whom he shares no biology, no culture, no connection whatsoever. Yet his immediate response was to protect them at personal risk. This is not logical. This is not strategic. This is fundamentally human. Zethara displayed data collected from centuries of observing human behavior. Humans have a history of fighting against their own self-interest to protect others. They have died to free slaves who were not their kin. They have sacrificed resources to save species on their planet from extinction. They have built entire systems of law around the concept that every individual, regardless of capability, has inherent worth. No other council species has this in their history. You all value the collective, the strong, the useful. Humans value existence itself. The council chamber fell silent as representatives processed this information. The Draconian ambassador, a scarred warrior named Gorath, spoke up. The Catherian suggests this is unique, but we Draconians see it as weakness. The strong survive. The weak perish. This is nature's law. Why should any species fight against it? Zethara's energy field flickered. Because humans do not accept nature's law as final. They believe they can improve upon it, and their history suggests they are correct. Humans went from primitive hunters to spacefaring civilization in a fraction of the time it took most council species. They did this not by being the strongest or the most logical, but by refusing to abandon anyone who could contribute. A human born weak can become strong. A human born different can change their world. They do not discard potential. They nurture it. A representative from the Vex species, crystalline beings who communicated through light patterns, added their perspective. We Vex have observed human colonies. They accommodate individuals with disabilities, inefficiencies, variations that would be eliminated in our creches. Yet their society does not collapse. Instead, these accommodated individuals often contribute in unexpected ways. Artists, thinkers, innovators who would not exist in optimization-focused cultures. The debate was shifting in ways the Zenthari had not anticipated. What had started as a simple case about law violation was becoming an examination of human nature and its place in the galactic community. Back on New Dakota, Jake was experiencing his own revelation about human nature. The small settlement had come together in a way he had never seen before. People who barely spoke to each other were now coordinating supply runs to keep Kate's medical station stocked. Former soldiers had quietly organized a watch rotation around the Morrison Ranch. Teachers were researching Zenthari culture to better understand what Hope and Dawn would need as they grew. One evening, an old woman named Margaret visited the ranch. She had lived on New Dakota since the first colonization wave and rarely left her home anymore. She carried a package wrapped in faded cloth. "I heard about what you did," Margaret said to Jake. "Heard you saved those babies. I wanted to give you this." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal an old photograph, faded and creased. It showed a young woman holding a small child. "That's me, 70 years ago, back on Earth. That baby is my daughter. She was born with a genetic condition that the doctors said would kill her before her first birthday. They suggested we not waste resources on her, let her pass peacefully." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "My husband and I refused. We fought for every treatment, every therapy, every chance she could get. She lived to be 43 years old. She became a teacher. She touched hundreds of lives, and all because we refused to give up on her. She pressed the photograph into Jake's hand. You did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you different. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the whole galaxy says you're wrong. Similar stories emerged from across the human colonies. People shared memories of loved ones who had been saved, protected, or given chances despite being written off by conventional wisdom. Humans who had been born with disabilities and went on to achieve remarkable things. Children who had been abandoned or orphaned and found new families. Individuals who had been considered hopeless and proved everyone wrong. Ambassador Hughes compiled these stories and presented them to the Galactic Council as evidence of what she called the human imperative. Every species here has traditions and values based on your evolutionary history, Claire argued. You developed what worked for your survival. But humanity's path was different. We survived not because we were the strongest or fastest or smartest. We survived because we cooperated, because we cared for our injured and elderly, because we refused to abandon our vulnerable. This trait is not a weakness. It is our greatest strength. It is what allowed us to build civilizations while other Earth species remained primitive, and it is what drives us now. She displayed images of Hope and Dawn, now almost 2 months old and visibly thriving under Kate's care. These infants were condemned to death for being different. But look at them now. They are healthy, growing, and according to our scientists, they possess cognitive abilities that could benefit the entire Zenthari species. By rigidly adhering to tradition, the Zenthari are eliminating their own potential for growth and change. Claire paused, looking at each council representative. We humans ask the council to consider this question. Is it more important to preserve tradition or to preserve life? Is it more valuable to maintain the way things have always been, or to embrace the possibility of what could be? We are not asking you to abandon your cultures. We are asking you to recognize that some principles, like the protection of helpless children, should transcend cultural boundaries. The Zenthari delegation remained unmoved. Thakzor responded with cold logic. Human ambassador makes emotional appeals, but emotion is not basis for law. Zenthari have maintained our culture for 15,000 years. We have never wavered. This stability is our strength. Humans have existed for mere thousands of years and achieved space travel only recently. You cannot lecture ancient species on how to maintain civilization. But cracks were forming in the Council's unity. Representatives from species who had never questioned their own traditions were now having private discussions. The Draconians, who had always valued strength, were debating whether their tradition of killing weak hatchlings was truly making them stronger. The Vex were examining whether their optimization processes were eliminating potential innovations. Even some Zenthari, particularly younger ones serving in support roles at the Council, were beginning to question. One young Zenthari technician, named Threkin, sent an anonymous message to Ambassador Hughes. The message contained research that had been suppressed by the Zenthari Hive Elders for decades. It showed that Zenthari innovation and technological advancement had stagnated for the past 3 centuries. While other species developed new technologies and expanded their capabilities, the Zenthari had remained static, endlessly repeating what they had always done. We are dying, the message read, not physically but creatively. By eliminating all variation, all individual thought, we have created a species that cannot change, cannot grow, cannot adapt. The infants your Jake Morrison saved represent something my people desperately need. The courage to be different. Claire shared this information carefully with select council members, planting seeds of doubt about whether the Zenthari way was as successful as claimed. The debate was no longer just about 2 infants on a frontier world. It had become about the future of how different species would interact, how laws would be interpreted, and whether there could be any universal principles in a diverse galaxy. The Galactic Council reached its decision after 3 weeks of debate. Jake Morrison would stand trial for violating the non-interference directive. The trial would take place on the Council Station, with representatives from all member species serving as judges. If found guilty, Jake could face up to 30 years in a containment facility, and the infants would be returned to Zenthari custody for proper tradition to be completed. When the summons arrived at New Dakota, Jake read it calmly. He had expected this outcome. Kate, however, was furious. They're going to put you on trial for saving lives. This is insane. Jake folded the official document and placed it on the table. It's politics, Kate. We knew it would come to this. The question is whether I can convince them that what I did was right. Governor Phillips arranged transport for Jake on a diplomatic vessel. The journey to the council station would take 2 weeks, even with faster-than-light travel. Kate wanted to come, but someone needed to stay with Hope and Dawn. The infants were now 3 months old and fully dependent on her care. They had bonded with Kate completely, responding to her voice and touch in ways that seemed almost human despite their alien biology. I'll take care of them, Kate promised as Jake prepared to leave. You just make sure you come back. Jake hugged his sister, feeling the weight of everything that rested on what would happen at the trial. I will. One way or another, this will work out. The council station was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It was a massive structure that housed thousands of beings from dozens of species. The architecture accommodated different gravitational needs, atmospheric requirements, and spatial preferences. Jake was assigned quarters in the human section, where Earth-normal conditions prevailed. He had 2 days to prepare before the trial began. Ambassador Claire Hughes met with him immediately. I've arranged for Daniel Cross to represent you. He's the best legal mind we have, and he's been studying this case since it began. He believes we can win. Daniel Cross was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes. He had spent 40 years practicing law, first on Earth and then in the complex world of galactic legislation. He shook Jake's hand firmly. I've read everything about your case. I've also spent considerable time studying the Non-Interference Directive and its history. I want you to understand something important. We're not going to deny that you violated the directive. That's undeniable. Instead, we're going to argue that the directive itself needs to be reinterpreted in light of fundamental principles that should transcend cultural boundaries. Jake listened as Daniel explained their strategy. They would present the case not as a violation that needed punishment, but as a moral imperative that exposed flaws in existing law. They would argue that protecting helpless infants was not cultural interference, but basic decency that any civilization should uphold. The trial began on a Monday morning, council station time. The chamber was filled with representatives from all member species, along with media correspondents and observers who had come from across the galaxy. This trial had captured attention in a way few galactic events ever did. The prosecution was led by a Zenthari legal expert named Vector, who had spent centuries studying interspecies law. His opening statement was precise and logical. The facts are simple. Jake Morrison, a human citizen of New Dakota Colony, physically prevented a Zenthari citizen from completing a legal and traditional cultural practice. He then took possession of Zenthari offspring without authority or permission. He has refused to return these offspring, despite multiple requests from their biological parent and official demands from the Zenthari government. These actions constitute a clear violation of the Non-Interference Directive, which exists to maintain peace and respect between our diverse species. The law must be upheld, or we descend into chaos where each species imposes its values upon others. Daniel Cross stood for the defense. His opening was equally direct. The prosecution is correct about the facts. Jake Morrison did everything they claim. But facts without context are meaningless. Yes, Jake interfered with a Zenthari cultural practice, but that practice was the burial of 2 living, healthy infants. The question before this council is not whether Jake violated a law. The question is whether that law should protect actions that end innocent lives. The trial proceeded with witness testimony and evidence presentation. The prosecution brought Zenthari scholars who explained their culture's history and the reasoning behind their traditions. They argued that maintaining hive cohesion required removing individuals who could not properly integrate. They presented data showing that their civilization had remained stable for thousands of years through strict adherence to these practices. The defense countered with expert witnesses of their own. Dr. Lisa Chen, the geneticist who had studied Hope and Dawn's genetic profiles, testified about the infant's potential. The mutation these infants carry is not a defect. It's an enhancement to cognitive abilities that allows for complex individual reasoning. The Zenthari call it a flaw because it disrupts their hive-mind connection. But from a biological standpoint, these infants are superior to standard Zenthari in several measurable ways. Killing them eliminates valuable genetic diversity and potential innovation. A human psychologist named Dr. Alan Foster testified about child development and the universal needs of infant beings across every intelligent species we've studied. Infants require care, protection, and nurturing. This appears to be a fundamental aspect of how complex life develops. Species that abandon or harm their young are acting against their own biological programming. The Xanthari tradition is not just culturally questionable, it's biologically aberrant. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Kyra, the young draconian warrior who had spoken during the earlier council debates, requested permission to testify. She stood in the witness area, her scaled body showing scars from countless battles. "I am Kyra of the Red Mountain Clan. I am a warrior of the Draconian Empire, and I should be dead." She explained her story in detail, how her mother had hidden her from the clan elders who would have killed her for being female, how she had trained in secret and eventually proven herself worthy, how she was now responsible for training the next generation of Draconian warriors, many of whom she had saved from similar fates. "My people valued tradition over potential. We lost countless warriors because we killed females at birth. Only in the last century did we begin to change this practice, and now our military is stronger than ever." Tradition is not always wisdom. Sometimes tradition is just fear of change dressed up as honor. Kyra looked directly at the Xanthari delegation. "You say Jake Morrison had no right to interfere, but I say he had an obligation. When you see something wrong, truly wrong, you have a choice. Stand by and let it happen or act." Jake acted. That makes him a warrior in my eyes, even if he carries no blade. The trial continued for days. Arguments flew back and forth about cultural autonomy versus universal rights, about tradition versus progress, about collective needs versus individual worth. Daniel Cross methodically built his case, showing that almost every species in the council had historical practices they had eventually abandoned because those practices harmed their own development. The Catherians used to eliminate any member whose thoughts could not be shared with the collective. They stopped this practice 4,000 years ago and subsequently experienced a golden age of philosophical advancement. The Vex used to destroy any crystal formation that did not conform to perfect geometric standards. They abandoned this practice and discovered new forms of technology. Even the Draconians, as we have heard, are reconsidering traditions that limit their potential. Daniel paused, letting the examples sink in. Change is not the enemy of culture. Stagnation is. And laws that prevent species from evolving, from questioning, from growing, are laws that harm everyone. Jake Morrison did not attack Xanthari culture. He saved 2 lives. If that's a crime, then every person in this chamber should be afraid of what kind of galaxy we're creating. The prosecution's final argument was simple. Emotion and philosophy are compelling, but law is what maintains order. If we allow humans to violate the non-interference directive based on their feelings, we must allow all species to do the same. The result will be constant conflict as each species tries to force their values on others. Jake Morrison must be found guilty to preserve the system that keeps peace between us all. Daniel Cross made his final statement directly to Jake, speaking as if they were alone in the room. Jake Morrison is not a diplomat or a lawyer or a politician. He's a ranch hand who went to water his horse. He witnessed something he knew was wrong and he acted. He did not consider the political consequences or calculate the diplomatic fallout. He just did what humans do. He protected children who needed protection. If we punish him for that, we're saying that law is more important than life. We're saying that maintaining the status quo matters more than doing what's right. I don't believe the members of this council want to send that message. The trial concluded and the council retired to deliberate. Jake was returned to his quarters to wait. The deliberation could take days or even weeks depending on how divided the council was. Jake spent the time in his quarters. While the Galactic Council deliberated on Jake Morrison's fate, something unexpected was happening across Xanthari space. The trial had been broadcast to all member species, including the Xanthari homeworld and its numerous colony worlds. For the first time in their recorded history, many Xanthari were questioning the foundations of their society. The movement started small, in the lower levels of the hive cities where younger Xanthari worked in technical and support roles. They gathered in private spaces, using encrypted communications to discuss what they had witnessed during the trial. The evidence about Hope and Dawn's genetic profiles had been particularly disturbing to many of them. These infants possessed enhanced cognitive abilities that could have benefited the entire species, yet tradition demanded their death simply because they were different. A scientist named Tharakin became the unofficial leader of what they began calling the Individuals Movement. She had been the one who sent anonymous research to Ambassador Hughes, showing how Zenthari innovation had stagnated. Now she decided it was time to speak openly. Despite the risk to her position and possibly her life, Tharakin published a research paper on the Zenthari public networks titled The Cost of Conformity. In it, she presented data spanning 3 centuries, showing a clear correlation between the rigid enforcement of hive conformity and the decline in Zenthari technological and cultural advancement. While other species in the Council had made leaps in science, art, and philosophy, the Zenthari had essentially been repeating the same patterns for generations. "We have become trapped in our own success," Tharakin wrote. "Our ancestors developed the hive mind as a survival mechanism, and it served us well. But what was once our strength has become our cage. We eliminate any deviation, any new thought, any possibility of change. We call it maintaining tradition, but what we are actually doing is choosing slow extinction over the uncertainty of growth." The paper went viral across Zenthari networks. The hive elders tried to suppress it, but information in a spacefaring civilization cannot be easily contained. Young Zenthari shared it, discussed it, and began to organize around its central message. The movement grew rapidly. Zenthari began refusing to participate in mercy removals, the traditional practice of eliminating defective offspring. When the elders ordered these refusals to be punished, thousands of Zenthari staged protests in the hive cities. This was unprecedented. The Zenthari had not experienced internal dissent in living memory. Kralthor, the biological father of Hope and Dawn, watched these developments with growing confusion and then understanding. He had been raised to believe that tradition was absolute, that the ways of the ancestors were beyond question. But seeing his species fracture over his own actions, he began to wonder if tradition was worth such a price. He requested a private communication with the human embassy on the Council station. Ambassador Hughes granted the request, curious about what the Zenthari who had started this entire crisis might want. Kralthor appeared on the communication screen, his compound eyes reflecting multiple camera angles. "I wish to speak about my offspring, about what I did, about what I am beginning to understand." Claire Hughes listened as Kralthor explained his internal struggle. "I buried my children because it was what one does, never questioned, never thought, just followed what generations before had followed. But watching trial, seeing evidence about their potential, hearing my own people argue about tradition, I am beginning to see I was wrong." He paused, his mandibles clicking slowly in what Claire had learned was a sign of emotional processing. "I want to see them, my offspring, want to understand what I almost destroyed." Claire considered the request carefully. This could be a trap or it could be an opportunity for something unprecedented. "I'll arrange transport for you to New Dakota, but you'll be accompanied by human security. And you need to understand something. Those infants are no longer your property. They're under the protection of Kate Morrison, and any decision about contact will be hers to make." Kralthor agreed to the terms. 3 days later, he arrived on New Dakota with an escort of human militia members. Kate was terrified when she heard he was coming, but Jake had sent her a message from the Council station encouraging her to at least hear what the Zenthari had to say. The meeting took place at the Morrison Ranch, with Governor Phillips and a dozen armed humans present. Kralthor entered the home slowly, his body language submissive and unthreatening. Kate stood near the makeshift cribs where Hope and Dawn were sleeping, her stance protective. "You tried to kill them," Kate said bluntly. "Why should I let you anywhere near them now?" Kralthor's answer was halting, translated through a device that struggled to convey Zenthari emotional nuance. "I have no good answer. I did what my culture taught was correct. But correct and right are not always same thing. I am learning this now. Too late, but learning." He moved closer, stopping when Kate tensed. "May I see them?" "Just see? I will not touch. Just want to understand what I almost lost." Kate hesitated, then nodded. She stepped aside, allowing Kralthor to approach the cribs. Hope and Dawn were awake now, their large compound eyes tracking movement. When Kralthor came into view, something remarkable happened. The infants did not recoil or show fear. Instead, they reached toward him with their small limbs making soft, chittering sounds. Kralthor stood frozen, watching his offspring respond to him. In Zenthari culture, there was no concept of parental bonding. Offspring were raised communally, with no distinction between biological parents and other caregivers. But standing there watching these tiny beings reach for him, something shifted in Kralthor's understanding of reality. "They recognize me," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "How is this possible?" "They should have no concept of biological parent." Kate moved beside him. "Maybe that's what makes them special. Maybe they can form connections that others in Thari can't. Individual bonds, personal relationships. That's not a defect. That's a gift." Over the next 3 days, Kralthor visited the ranch daily. Kate taught him how to care for the infants, how to interpret their sounds and movements, how to respond to their needs. It was awkward at first. Zenthari limbs were not designed for the delicate care that human hands could provide. But Kralthor adapted, learning with a determination that surprised Kate. On the 3rd day, he asked Kate about human parent-child relationships. She explained the concept of family, of love between parents and offspring, of the bonds that held humans together across distance and time. Kralthor listened intently, processing ideas that had no equivalent in his culture. "This is what we lost," he said finally, "this connection. My ancestors bred it out of us because it was inefficient, because it distracted from hive unity. But maybe they removed something essential, something that makes life worth living beyond mere function." That evening, Kralthor made a recording. It would be broadcast across all Zenthari networks and presented to the Galactic Council. In it, he spoke directly to his species. "I am Kralthor of the Western Hive. I am the biological parent of the offspring called Hope and Dawn by humans. I attempted to complete traditional mercy removal on these offspring because they carried genetic deviation. I believed I was following correct practice, honoring the ways of our ancestors." He paused, his body language conveying deep emotion. "I was wrong. I have spent 3 days observing my offspring. They are healthy. They are intelligent. They possess abilities that could benefit our entire species. But more than that, they possess something I cannot fully explain. Individuality, personality, the ability to form bonds that transcend hive. Programming." Kralthor's compound eyes reflected the light as he continued. "The human Kate Morrison has shown my offspring more care than any hive nursery could provide. She has taught me what my culture has forgotten, that each life has value beyond its utility to the collective. That connection between individuals can be as important as unity of purpose. That change is not betrayal of tradition but evolution of understanding." He made his final statement directly to the hive elders. "I formally request that my offspring remain with Kate Morrison. She has proven herself worthy guardian, and I request that the Galactic Council establish protections for all young beings, regardless of species. Some traditions must end if we are to grow. The mercy removal practice is one such tradition. We have sacrificed too much potential, too many unique minds in the name of conformity. It is time for Zenthari to choose evolution over stagnation." The recording spread across Zenthari space within hours. The reaction was explosive. The individuals' movement, which had been growing steadily, suddenly swelled to include millions of Zenthari. Protests became larger and more organized. Young Zenthari demanded reform, questioning not just the mercy removal practice but the entire structure of their rigid society. The hive elders were faced with a crisis unlike any in their history. They could try to suppress the movement through force, but that would fracture their society beyond repair, or they could accept that change was inevitable and try to guide it rather than resist it. Tarakin led a delegation of reform-minded Zenthari to meet with the elders. The meeting lasted for 3 days, with both sides presenting their arguments. The elders maintained that abandoning tradition would destroy everything the Zenthari had built. The Galactic Council reconvened on a Thursday morning to deliver their verdict on Jake Morrison. The chamber was more crowded than it had been for the trial itself. Representatives from every member species attended, along with observers from dozens of non-member civilizations who had been following the case. The human section was packed with colonists who had traveled from across human space to witness the outcome. Jake sat in the defendant's area with Daniel Cross beside him. Ambassador Hughes sat in the diplomatic section, her face carefully neutral despite the anxiety she felt. This verdict would define humanity's relationship with the galactic community for generations to come. The council speaker, a lumen named Vexrel who existed as a glowing sphere of energy, addressed the chamber. The Galactic Council has reached a decision regarding the human Jake Morrison and the violation of the Non-Interference Directive. This case has required extensive deliberation and has raised questions that extend far beyond the immediate facts. Vexrel paused, their light pulsing in patterns that conveyed gravity and importance. Jake Morrison is found guilty of violating the Non-Interference Directive. This violation is clear and undeniable. He physically prevented a Zenthari citizen from completing a cultural practice and took possession of Zenthari offspring without authorization. The human section of the chamber erupted in protest. Ambassador Hughes closed her eyes, preparing for the worst. But Vexrel continued, however, this council recognizes that the Non-Interference Directive was created to prevent one species from imposing their values on another in matters of cultural expression and societal organization. It was not created to protect practices that cause harm to defenseless beings. The Council has determined that the protection of infant life represents a principle that transcends cultural boundaries. The chamber fell silent, everyone processing what they were hearing. Therefore, while Jake Morrison is found technically guilty of the violation, he is immediately and fully pardoned due to the extraordinary circumstances. Furthermore, the Non-Interference Directive is hereby amended to include provisions allowing intervention in cases of imminent harm to beings who cannot defend themselves. This amendment will be known as the Morrison Protocols. Cheers erupted from the human section. Jake sat stunned, barely able to process what had just happened. Daniel Cross gripped his shoulder, grinning broadly. Vexrel waited for the noise to subside before continuing. Additionally, this council recognizes the need for establishing baseline standards for the treatment of all sentient beings, particularly the young and vulnerable. A committee will be formed to develop these standards, with representatives from all member species. The goal is not to eliminate cultural diversity, but to ensure that certain fundamental rights are protected across all civilizations. The Zenthari section was notably divided. The older delegates sat in rigid silence, their body language conveying disapproval. But younger Zenthari, including Tharakan, who had been invited as an observer, made clicking sounds of approval. Vexrel concluded the announcement. This council believes that diverse species can coexist while still upholding certain universal principles. We hope that this decision represents not an ending, but a beginning of a more just and compassionate galactic community. Jake was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Humans, Draconians, even some Catherians expressed their approval of the verdict. Ambassador Hughes made her way through the crowd to reach him. You did it, Jake. You changed the galaxy. Jake shook his head. I just saved 2 babies. The galaxy changed itself, but he knew it was more than that. Sometimes one person doing the right thing at the right moment could set off a chain reaction that transformed everything. 3 days later, Jake boarded a transport back to New Dakota. He was exhausted from interviews, meetings, and celebrations, and he just wanted to go home. The journey gave him time to think about everything that had happened. He had left his ranch as a simple ranch hand and was returning as someone whose name would be in history books. The thought made him uncomfortable. He had never wanted fame or recognition. He had just wanted to do what was right. When his transport landed at New Dakota's small spaceport, Jake was surprised by what he found. Hundreds of colonists had gathered to welcome him home. They cheered as he disembarked, and Governor Phillips presented him with a Medal of Honor from the colonial government. Jake accepted it graciously but quickly made his way through the crowd toward the Morrison Ranch. Kate was waiting at the ranch entrance with Hope and Dawn. The infants were now 4 months old and had grown significantly. Their exoskeletons were hardening and their movements were more coordinated. When they saw Jake, they made excited chittering sounds and reached toward him. Jake took them carefully, one in each arm, and felt tears sting his eyes. I'm home, he said to Kate, and I'm never leaving again. Kate hugged her brother, the 3 of them creating a small circle of warmth in the cool evening air. Kralthor is inside, Kate said quietly. He's been waiting for you. Jake carried the infants into the house where Kralthor stood in the main room. The Zenthari had been living in a small building on the ranch property for the past week, learning to care for his offspring and beginning to understand human concepts of family. Jake Morrison, Crowthor said formally. You have returned. The council ruled in your favor. Jake nodded. They did. And from what I hear, your people are going through some big changes. Crowthor's mandibles clicked in what Jake had learned was the Zenthari equivalent of a rueful laugh. Changes that terrify the elders and excite the young. My species stands at a crossroads. We can continue as we have been and slowly fade into irrelevance, or we can embrace variation and all the chaos that comes with it. He moved closer to Jake, looking at his offspring. I have made a decision. I wish to formally relinquish parental claim to Hope and Dawn. Kate Morrison has proven herself far more capable guardian than I could ever be. She understands their needs in ways I am only beginning to learn, but I request permission to remain involved in their lives, to learn from them as they grow, to be part of their journey. Jake looked at Kate, who nodded. That's Kate's decision more than mine. They're her kids now. Kate stepped forward. You can be part of their lives, Crowthor. Not as owner or biological parent in the traditional sense, but as family. We'll figure out what that means together. Crowthor's body language conveyed deep gratitude. Family. I am learning this human concept. It is strange and inefficient and completely illogical, and yet it feels more right than anything my hive mind ever taught me. Over the following weeks, an unusual household formed on the Morrison Ranch. Jake, Kate, 2 Zenthari infants, and occasionally Crowthor when he visited from his role as a liaison between the Zenthari reformers and human diplomatic corps. It should have been awkward, but somehow it worked. They developed routines, established boundaries, and created something that had never existed before, a truly mixed species family. News of their arrangement spread, and other species began to take notice. The concept of adoption across species lines was not unheard of, but it was extremely rare. What the Morrisons were building became a model that others began to follow. A draconian warrior adopted a young Vex whose crystalline formation was considered flawed. A Catherian collective took in orphaned human children whose parents had died in a colony accident. Barriers that had seemed absolute began to dissolve. Jake returned to his work on the ranch, though he now had help. Volunteers from the colony came regularly to assist, wanting to be part of something they saw as important. The watering hole where Jake had found Hope and Dawn became a local landmark. Someone erected a small monument there, 2 handprints pressed into synthetic stone. 1 human, 1 Zenthari. One evening, about 2 months after the trial, Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset. Hope and Dawn played in the yard under Kate's supervision, their movements becoming more confident each day. They were learning to communicate, mixing Zenthari clicking with attempts at human words. Kate was documenting everything, creating a record that scientists across the galaxy studied with fascination. Crowthor approached and settled beside Jake in a posture that approximated human, sitting. I have been asked to speak at the Galactic Council next month, to present a Zenthari perspective on the changes in my society. They want me to discuss my personal journey from following tradition to questioning it. Jake nodded. That's good. Your people need voices like yours. Crowthor was quiet for a moment, watching his offspring play. I wonder sometimes what my ancestors would think. They built our entire civilization on the principle of conformity and collective purpose. I am helping to dismantle that in favor of individuality and personal choice. Am I honoring them or betraying them? Jake thought about his own ancestors, humans who had fought and struggled to build a better world. Maybe you're doing both, honoring the good parts of what they built, while having the courage to change the parts that don't work anymore. That's not betrayal, that's growth. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 beings from completely different evolutionary paths, united by their care for 2 small lives that represented the future. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the yard, Hope made a sound that was almost a laugh, and Dawn mimicked it. 5 years passed, and the galaxy was different. Not dramatically. Not in ways that casual observers might immediately notice, but in fundamental shifts that were changing how species interacted with each other and themselves. The Morrison protocols had been implemented across all council space, and while enforcement was inconsistent and debates continued about specific applications, the principle had been established. Some rights transcended culture, and the protection of helpless beings was one of them. Jake Morrison still lived on his ranch on New Dakota, though the small homestead had grown considerably. The main house had been expanded to accommodate a growing family, and several outbuildings had been constructed to house the stream of visitors who came to study, or simply witness what many called the Morrison experiment. Kate had officially adopted Hope and Dawn through a complex legal process that involved both human and Xanthari law, creating precedent for cross-species adoption that was being replicated across dozens of worlds. On a warm spring morning, Jake rode his horse toward the old watering hole. It had become a weekly tradition, a way to remember where everything had started and to reflect on how far they had all come. The monument had been expanded over the years. The original handprints remained, but surrounding them now were messages carved in multiple languages from various species. Beings from across the galaxy had visited this spot and left their mark, creating an unofficial memorial to the idea that compassion could cross any boundary. As Jake dismounted to water his horse, he saw two figures running across the plains toward him. Hope and Dawn, now 5 years old, were racing each other through the tall grass. They had grown into remarkable young beings, their bodies taking on the adult Xanthari form while their minds developed in ways that continued to fascinate scientists. They were fully bilingual, speaking both English and Xanthari click language fluently. More impressively, they had developed the ability to partially connect with Xanthari hive minds while maintaining their individual consciousness, something that researchers believed could revolutionize how Xanthari society functioned. "Jake, wait for us," Hope called out in clear English. She was the more outgoing of the two, always eager to explore and ask questions. Dawn followed closely, quieter but intensely observant. Already showing signs of becoming a deep thinker, Jake waited as they caught up, both of them slightly out of breath from their run. "Kate said you were coming to the water hole. Can we come with you?" Dawn asked. Jake smiled. "Of course. This place is as much yours as it is mine." They walked together to the monument and the children placed their hands on the carved prints, a ritual they had developed over the years. Hope looked up at Jake with her large compound eyes. "Is it true that you almost got locked up for saving us? That the whole galaxy thought you did something wrong?" Jake knelt down so he was at their eye level. "Some people thought I did something wrong, but more people understood why I did it. And in the end, everyone realized that protecting kids like you is more important than following rules that don't make sense." Dawn touched the Xanthari handprint thoughtfully. "Our biological father thought we should die. But now he visits us and teaches us about Xanthari culture. How did he change so much?" It was a question Jake had thought about often. People can change when they're willing to question what they've been taught. Your father was brave enough to admit he was wrong and to try to understand a different way of thinking. That's not easy for anyone, whether you're human or Xanthari or anything else. Hope moved away from the monument, looking out across the plains. At school, some of the other kids ask us what we are. Human or Xanthari? We don't know how to answer. Jake stood up and put a hand on each of their shoulders. "You're both, and neither. You're something new. You're the future." They rode back to the ranch together, Jake on his horse while Hope and Dawn walked alongside. The ranch had become a hub of activity over the years. Human and Xanthari children played together in the yard, part of an experimental education program that brought different species together from a young age. Scientists conducted long-term studies on cross-species socialization. Diplomats used the ranch as neutral ground for sensitive negotiations. What had started as a simple homestead had evolved into something much larger. Kate was in the medical building she had established, examining a young draconian who had been born with a limb deformity. In the old days, such a hatchling would have been killed immediately. Now parents from across the galaxy brought their children to Kate, knowing she would help regardless of species or ability to pay. She had become famous in medical circles for her work in cross-species pediatrics, publishing papers and training other doctors in techniques she had developed while caring for Hope and Dawn. Kralthor was there too, having taken a permanent position as cultural liaison on New Dakota. He worked to help Xanthari families understand their offspring who showed individual tendencies, teaching them techniques he had learned from Kate. The transformation in him was remarkable. The rigid traditionalist who had tried to bury his children was now an advocate for change and growth. He had even taken a name choice, something Xanthari rarely did, selecting a human-style name, Carl. It was close to his original designation but represented his embrace of individual identity. That evening, the extended family gathered for dinner, a tradition they maintained despite busy schedules. Jake, Kate, Hope, Dawn, Carl. and several others who had become part of their unusual household, sat around a large table that accommodated both human and Xanthari physiology. "I received a message from Ambassador Hughes today," Kate announced. "The Galactic Council wants to establish a permanent institute